They wouldn't return phone calls. They wouldn't answer letters. It was as if they didn't want us to have the answers. Well, eventually we came up with a lot of indications that Bob did work there. We found, for example, the newspaper from Los Alamos that lists him as being a physicist from the lab. We found the laboratory telephone book that lists him as being an employee at the lab. We have talked to other people at the lab who worked with him, who tell us that Bob did work on classified projects, that he was a physicist, that he was there. Just this week, almost 4 years after we first started making our inquiries at Los Alamos, we finally got someone from the lab to say, yes, Bob Lazar was here. Yes, he worked at the Mason facility. Yes, that facility did some classified work. It's taken a long time, but now we know that Bob was there. We know he had a security clearance, but we still know that there are a lot of the records that we're searching have not been produced for us. We don't know why.
What convinced you most that Bob Lazar told you the truth?
Well, I'm not 100% sure about everything that he says, because as journalists, we have to be somewhat skeptical. But a couple of things stand out in my mind. Number one is that Bob has always told the same story. The story that he told me on the first day that I met him about his experiences at S4 is the same story he tells today. And most importantly, when Bob got into some legal trouble, which in the eyes of many people means that he's completely discredited. When he got into his legal trouble, he told the court system the exact same thing. Now, the courts, the interesting thing is, they're trying to verify his background, the probation department, and they said, we can't verify his background, therefore he should go to prison. Well, my response to it is, welcome to the club. You can't get any information on his background. Bob was facing up to 60 years in prison if he did not tell the truth about his background, and the story that he told to the court is the same story that he told to me on the first day and the same story that he's telling today.
After you interviewed Lazar on TV, did you come in contact with other witnesses from Area 51?
Several witnesses, more than a dozen now in total, have come forward with bits and pieces of information that confirm at least parts of what Bob said. No one has come forward with the kind of broad knowledge that he claimed, but what I have learned from these other people tends to confirm that what Bob is saying is true. The problem is that none of them have been willing to talk publicly. They will give me bits and pieces of information privately, but I'm restricted from using their names. And there's some very good reasons for that. There's been an obvious attempt to intimidate these witnesses into keeping their mouths shut. The 3 examples come to mind. One is a former electrical engineer who worked in the television business, who moved from Las Vegas and whom I worked with, moved to another city. He had told me by phone that he had seen a disc under a tarp in a building at Groom Lake. Well, I tried to arrange to do an interview, long-distance interview, with a camera crew in the city where he lives. He agreed to do it as long as I blacked out his face. He comes out the morning after he makes the agreement to give me this interview. There's a car sitting in front of his house, 2 men in suits speaking into a radio. He's not giving it much of a thought, but they followed him to work. When he gets out of work, they followed him home. No interview. He was scared. There's a woman who works in the court system here in Las Vegas, in a very responsible position, who formerly worked for a major defense contractor here in Nevada. She had sat in on meetings where she said the discussion between her employer and military officials was about wreckage from Roswell, which had been taken to Area 51, alien wreckage. She had agreed to give me this information in a private meeting that we were going to have, but the day that the meeting was supposed to happen, she didn't show up, and I found out later she'd been visited by her former employers, and they had told her she's still under oath, she could be prosecuted, but what's more, her employers hinted that harm could come to this woman or her family if she talked to me. They said, we know you do a lot of traveling, we'd hate for accidents to happen to you or your family. So she will still not talk to me now 3 years later. There was a third example, this man who performed the tax returns of persons who worked at Area 51. He had called me up on the phone at the TV station and told me he would meet and give me this information. The next day, he's visited by 2 men who say that they're from the Secret Service, and they wanted to ask him about his tax returns, but he said that it was his definite impression they didn't care about his tax returns. They just wanted him to shut up and not talk about Area 51. So there are a lot of people like that who have information, who could confirm Bob Lazar's story if they had the courage to come forward. I can't really blame them for not coming forward, because our government, or elements of our government, or representatives of our government seem to use intimidation and fear tactics to keep these people quiet.
The only evidence that we got is we were able to steal or otherwise obtain a piece of the fuel that powers the saucers. It was element 115. It's a stable element, and we did several experiments with this. We also videotaped these experiments. The experiment was to prove the high gravitational attraction, the heaviness of the element, and other things. We proved it to ourselves. Unfortunately, whoever is in charge of the cover-up stole it back. The other thing was that on March 21st, 1989, he asked me if I wanted to view one of the test flights. This was on a Tuesday, and I said, well, sure, but how are we going to see one? And he said, there's going to be a test flight tomorrow night just at sunset. And I know a place where we can sneak in, still be on public land, and watch it. I said, great. So I said, why at sunset? And he said, well, statistically, up in that area, there's the least traffic around then. So I drove with Bob and the real estate appraiser, Gene Huff, and myself, and we drove up there, got there just a little bit before sunset. I took my Celestron telescope, we took a video camera, got out of the car, and within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, this disc comes up from behind the mountains and starts doing all these fantastic maneuvers. It was a light, a very bright light, and you couldn't see the disc form. But I had my Celestron scope with me, which is 8 inches, extremely powerful, and after a few minutes I was able to get it right in the finder of the Celestron telescope, and I saw for myself it was a disc. There was no question in my mind, and I just watched it go down behind the mountains.
We had heard about this location, and actually the information ultimately had come from John Lear, we found out. We heard about the 29.5-mile marker, the famous mailbox area. So we went up there. Our first trip was the first Saturday in January of 1990. And we arrived there about 10:30 at night, and while we didn't see anything on that trip, it was a Saturday night, we found out that the active nights are Monday through Friday, and the weekends are usually shut down. But what we did find out, there were several other vehicles up there, 3 motorhomes and a couple of passenger cars, and talking with those people, we found out that they, having had gone out there on numerous other occasions, had seen plenty. So we were determined that, and we had understood from the beginning, that this was going to be something where on one night you would see nothing, and on the next night all hell might break loose. So we were prepared for the long haul. We were going to continue going out there until we should eventually see something. So then upon returning back home, I discovered that I could tune in the Billy Goodman happening out of Las Vegas in Santa Monica. I could receive it. So I started listening, and almost the first night, Bob Lazar was being interviewed by Billy Goodman. And I listened intensely. And I discovered from Lazar's interview that the best nights to go out there are Wednesday nights, that they pull out most of the stops on Wednesday nights. Now, the reason for that was explained, that when they were preparing this facility and the operation, they did a study on Highway 375, the public highway through the action zone, Tickaboo Valley. And they determined from their study that there was the least traffic on Wednesday nights on Highway 375. So that's why Wednesday nights were chosen for most of the action. Although we, in having made numerous other trips, determined that almost any weeknight is effective, Monday through Friday. But Wednesdays always seems to be the most prolific, probably for that reason. But then, of course, we wondered that since we were going out there on a Wednesday night, maybe that would perturb the formula, and then, of course, it would shift to some other weeknight. Who knows? So, but still, nevertheless, it seems that Wednesday nights still continue to dominate with the greatest amount of activity out there. So, our next trip was Wednesday, February 28th. Now, on our first trip, I had gathered together about 7 or 8 friends, and we caravanned out there and saw nothing, of course. Then I started organizing the same group of friends to make this second trip.